Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on Meet the Author with Sally Kempton. And this month's book was Meditation for the Love of It. And I just want to thank you, Sally, for joining us, which is such a treat. And I chose this book. Well, first, I love you, but I also chose this book because Meditation for the Love of It. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the other reasons, but just the first and primary reason is when I've read this book versus other books on meditation, I was really touched by just how much of a humanistic experience it was, meaning that it never felt anything but a very human experience connecting to the other human experience of exploring this process of meditation. And so for me, it was always, I was so touched by that in reading it that I absolutely wanted to make sure that that was one of our first books that we had on this, this series. And I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the other things that were really meaningful. But so I just want to say thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Scott.
So Sally, one of the first questions that sort of came up, and I think, while more people are familiar with this general idea of meditation, or they're at least have had some exposure to it, the concept of where meditation and Tantra meet seemed to be quite new for people. And one of the phrases you used in your book that was so clear and succinct, to use that word again, was that you described Tantra, the practice of Tantra, as any movement, anything that can unite us with the divine. And I thought that was such a clear, succinct, specific reference to sort of the intentionality of Tantra. But I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about where is the intersection between sort of what is more globally experienced as meditation and more specifically tantric intention.
Okay, interesting question. Well, of course, the goal of yoga is to unite with the divine. And oops, sorry, getting all these messages on my screen. So in that sense, Tantra is a branch of yoga. What I would say is the most significant thing to understand about Tantra is that it uses the entire physical, psychic, mental, emotional system in meditation, which not all yoga teachings do, not all yoga practices do. So Tantra is very much about embodiment, but I would say, at least in classical Tantra, not so much about the physical body as about particularly the subtle body and the channels in the subtle body, the chakras, the currents that flow through the subtle body. And what I call real tantric meditation is meditation in which you begin to inhabit your subtle body, specifically learning how to open the realms in different chakras, learning how to extend the subtle body so that you begin to realize that your actual body is much larger than the physical body. So, and in that sense, when you practice tantric meditation, what you're essentially doing is expanding, or at least beginning to expand your subtle body, and therefore your sense of self. And in a certain sense, Tantra, even though, of course, Hatha Yoga is very much a tantric practice, but, and all yogic practices use a lot of pranayama. They work very much with the pranic currents. Tantra is especially about prana. And and how you work with prana, how you transform prana, how you use your prana to transform you. So the other thing about Tantra that has really seeped into what I would call mainstream yoga, meaning that when we talk about many of the practices that originated in Tantra, we're talking about practices that are so much a part of our contemporary yoga practice that you wouldn't even necessarily identify them as tantric. So for instance, many visualization practices. Visualization is one of the strategies of Tantra, that you visualize the body in different ways. You visualize deities, you install deities in your body, and in that way you use your visual imagination to actually, the idea is you create inwardly a different kind of body, a kind of divine body that you can identify with higher beings, higher realms of consciousness. And you very often do it through visualization. Tantra uses a lot of mantra practice, a lot of sound practice, and a lot of imaginative practice. So, one of the interesting things that I discovered when I first started studying Tantra was to realize that how many of the new thought practices that are the way many Westerners especially get into meditation. A lot of new thought practices, imaginative practices, the kind of practices that teachers like Shakti Gawain and Louise M. Hay have taught in contemporary Western neo-traditions. Most of them are tantric originally. So Tantra is really about direct transformation of your systems through mantra, through visualization, and in my specialty, my particular interest in sort of kindling your feeling sense through the prana of the subtler levels of both the physical and the subtle body.
Can you define what you mean by, I know the subtle body is a term that's used, but I think would you be willing to just define what you mean by subtle?
Sure. So the subtle body, which there's a Sanskrit word for it, the sukshma sharira, which means subtle body. Subtle body is the energy body that interpenetrates the physical and also extends beyond it. So in my experience, the subtle body, I'm reaching my hands out. The subtle body actually normally extends the length of your arms around your physical body. And it also interpenetrates the physical body through the system of nadis and chakras. So, in Chinese medicine and in Ayurveda and in Tantric yoga, in all the yoga systems that work with Kundalini energy, etc., there's the understanding that there are innumerable energetic channels that flow through the physical body, but that are not physical. They're subtle. They're the pathways through which the prana shakti, the life force, flows. So essentially, the subtle body is made of prana. It's made of our energy systems. It's also made of thought. So the subtle body is both the realm of energy, the realm of prana. It's also the realm of thought. It's the realm, we could say, of mind as opposed to the brain. And because it interpenetrates the physical body, as pretty much everybody knows these days, the state of the prana and the nature of your thoughts are going to have an enormous impact on your physical experience.
Yeah, when you say that, I'm reminded how people like Bruce Lipton's work sort of codified sort of what was already known through these thousands of years of practice.
Yeah, exactly. And as as modern Westerners, we tend to believe scientific explanations of these subtle things.
actually brings me to something, one of the other reasons I picked this book as sort of my hope for the first book that we chose, and a question that came up among a few people was around the science and the practice. And I think one of the things you said in this book was you sort of named it as sort of there's so much emphasis on the health benefits and the neurobiological effects of meditation that we sometimes might lose sight of that it's also this deep play within connecting to the divine or connecting to Shakti, and or just even the play of meditation, as you described, or the playfulness that can be inherent in it. And I think when I had read that in your book, it was such a turning point for me because, well, I had practiced meditation for some time. I had been sort of consumed years after starting with the neuroscience of it, and really sort of losing sight of just the love of it and the joy of it, that was devoid of having to be weighed down by the science of it. So I was wondering about, like, how do you navigate sort of this wealth of technology and wisdom with this sort of incoming stimulus of scientific data?
I have to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
I don't. Or let's say I find the neuroscience really interesting. And the thing that I have noticed about neuroscience is that in general, what they're talking about is stuff that that yogis have known for centuries. And what neuroscientists are doing is measuring the way the transformative changes that meditation and yoga create in the system. They're measuring it through looking at brain states.
Yeah.
And it's completely interesting.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the neuroscientific insights that I most remember is reading an article by Dan Goldman about the effects of meditation. He was reporting on Richard Davison's experiments at the University of Wisconsin and I think the one that impressed me most was about these very highly stressed biotech workers who were given a mindfulness practice and asked to do it for 3 weeks. And they measured their brains before and they measured their brains afterwards. And they discovered that after 3 weeks of meditation, there was some very remarkable increase in activity in the part of the brain that creates happiness, less in the part of the brain that shows up in depression. And I remember Goldman saying, wow, I was so impressed by this. I realized I've been neglecting my meditation and I decided I better go back to it. So I've come to the conclusion that, you know, because we are so physically oriented in our society, that to get information, neuroscientific information about the way meditation changes your brain tends to give people a bigger impetus to meditate than just being told that if you meditate, you're going to experience these subtle changes in well-being. You're going to get closer to the divine. You're going to come to know yourself. These are very vague promises and ideas, especially because very few people experience the dramatic shifts that meditation is capable of giving you in short periods of time. This isn't true for everybody, but you know, many people that I know who begin meditation are like, what's happening? Nothing's happening. All I do is sit and think. So it's, you know, it's very important, and the sages have always made huge promises. If you meditate, this is going to happen. So the neuroscientific discoveries, I would say, give people a certain confidence that even if they're not having dramatic experiences, that something good is happening. And therefore, I think it's extremely helpful. People like Andrew Newberg and Goldman and, of course, Richard Davison are doing this work. That said, In my experience, we really need motivation to meditate every day. And the reason is that, well, there's many reasons. One reason being that we're tremendously busy. The second reason being that our senses tend to be so outgoing, so focused on the outside, especially at times like this when we just have so much on our plate, so much to worry about, so much uncertainty in the world, that the idea of actually sitting quietly and bringing your mind and senses back inside, it feels daunting to most people. So in order to do it, and in order to receive the benefits of meditation, you actually have to do it, and you have to do it regularly. If you do it regularly, then transformative experience, I'm not necessarily talking about dramatic, light shows and bliss experiences, but very palpable inner changes are going to happen after 2 or 3 months of steady meditation, and way more over a period of years. If I'm sure, Scott, you've read the studies that have been done by, I think they were done around TM, and I know that the people in Yogi Bhajan's and Kundalini tradition have also done a number of studies on the effects of meditation on health, on blood pressure, etc. So it seems like there's something very important and powerful about knowing that meditation is going to improve your health, because there are actually not that many people who go into meditation wanting to know God or wanting to extract the part of themselves that is, that is blissful, that is free of suffering. What tends to happen is that, you start meditating for health-related reasons, or, because you've been told that your stress levels can be managed through meditation. And in the course of it, you start to realize how much better you feel, how much smarter you are, how many gifts meditation can give you, and you begin to be interested in going further. So I would say, I don't really care why anybody starts meditation. I think, one thing we have come to realize is that no matter why you start meditation, no matter what your motivation is, as a simple daily meditation practice of at least 15 or 20 minutes is going to make a huge difference in the way you experience your life. And my book, Meditation for the Love of It, it actually is not a book for beginners. It's a book that came out of my intention to take my practice to the next level. And so this is the thing I would like to make clear about it, and what I think is the gift that Meditation for the Love of It can give you if you really get into it. Because here's the thing, if you're meditating daily and conscientiously in a routine way, if it's part of your routine, like brushing your teeth, which I think meditation should be, it's a significant intervention to do on the part of for the sake of your health and well-being. But it's going to get, for most people, it's going to get routinized, it's going to get boring, it's going to begin to seem like a duty, especially for people who don't have a lot of dramatic experiences. And then there's a couple of things that have to come online in order for you to get interested in going deeper. So one of the reasons that you might decide you want to go deeper is because you've heard all these things about what meditation can be, and you get excited, and you want to find out, oh, are there really lights in my Ajna chakra? Is it really possible that my heart can be a fountain of blissfulness? Okay, I'm willing to commit some time to finding out what that means. Or, if you're doing a more Buddhist practice, can I really have a clear mind? Can I really experience the interdependency of my own consciousness and others? Meditation is the means. I'm going to explore it. So in order to go deeper in meditation, there has to be a motivation. And for most people, it's a kind of, the main motivation turns out to be a kind of curiosity about what our potential is, as a human organism. Um, the the motivation that I talk about in the book and that you mentioned, Scott, that the deepest motivation, let's call it the highest motivation, the most religious or spiritual motivation, is to know your essence, or to know God, or to know the divine. And there are people who are temperamentally interested in that. I certainly was. But your motivation does not have to be that deep or that intense. However, I do believe that the more we can have curiosity about the essential being that underlies our physical body, our psychic body, the more we can recognize that when so many great thinkers and great practitioners have talked about the deepest form of potential that we have as human beings, that at a certain point, I was going to say we have to, but it's not really a matter of have to. And at a certain point, as we mature, the question begins to arise, isn't there more than this? Isn't there more to experience in this life? And I believe that this is the deepest reason for practicing meditation, is to know your own potential. And at that point, this is the point from which I wrote the book, because having meditated, I think at that point I'd been meditating daily, regularly, and for about 15 years. And I meditated 40 minutes to an hour every day. It definitely had all the effects that Richard Davidson talks about. It improved every aspect of my physical and mental and emotional health. But I wasn't having those experiences of the deep self. So I created a program for myself where I began to experiment with different practices to see which practices tended to jumpstart my connection to my deeper soul. And that's what the book is really about. It's like, how do you do this? How do you take your meditation, not just to the next level, but to all the levels beyond it? And so it's not really a book for beginners. So there's a whole section about how you get into meditation. It's a book for intermediate students. And I recommend it to people who have, especially to people who have done some practice and who want to know what else there is, because, sorry to be doing a commercial, I don't believe there is another book available that actually approaches meditation as an activity to which you can bring your own creativity. So
one of the reasons I love it.
I think that's one of the reasons I had to write it. It's one of the reasons, why I really think it's an important book.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't think I'd read a book where I was like, what do you mean there's play? Like that I can play and discover and craft and create, as you're saying, which it stands out as really a special, and this is what I think I also meant by it's very humanistic. It recognizes the curious nature of our human presence is this sort of process of needing to play and create and devise. And I think you identified that, or
Yeah.
that innate essence.
Well, I practice meditation as a recreational activity, and it's something I enjoy. Not everyone has that relationship with meditation, but meditation can be a recreational activity. It can be something you really enjoy. And once you've sort of gotten into that mindset, and once you've realized that in order to be a good meditator or a successful meditator, You don't have to follow the instructions that you got from your first meditation teacher or that you got from the books you've read. You actually can make it up as you go along, honestly. You have your soul, your mind, your creativity has the capacity to make up every level of psychic intervention. And you can use your meditative capacity to explore your inner body, to explore your mind, to, to actually get creative in asking questions to yourself. And one of the things that I have found most enjoyable is actually to open up a sense of connection to a chakra or to the inner central channel, which is the true entrance into the deepest aspect of the subtle body, and just begin to explore what it feels like to be in different realms of your physical and subtle body. So in that sense, if you're somebody who's interested in self-transformation or self-discovery, if you're willing to be adventurous in your meditation practice, you can find out a lot of things about yourself, and you can work on your health. You can work on your repetitive thinking patterns. You can create intentions for yourself, imagine they're coming into fruition, and actually change your life through meditation. It's an unbelievably creative act. And the more, let's call it the higher, the more global, the more adventurous your understanding about meditation is, it can take you all the way up to a state of oneness with the divine. And that, again, I would say that doesn't take that long. If you meditate for a year or so, with the intention to truly explore, you can find yourself in kind of mind-blowing recognitions of how much larger you are than you ever imagined.
Thank you. One of the things that I also think makes you stand out as a teacher, Sally, is the way in which you empower people to take it back, that their practice, their journey is theirs.
Yeah.
And I know the teachers I had before you, I never felt that permission. It was about following these direct practices or the way that it was taught. And I think the first time it was either when I heard you on a podcast or read one of your books, or it was so clear that you were about empowering each individual in their journey.
Yeah.
And giving them agency.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? I mean, it's so unique.
Well, it's completely has to do with my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I was, I mean, I won't go into the whole, back and forth of my spiritual journey, but when I met my guru, my main teacher, Swami Muktananda, he gave very, very specific meditation instructions. And basically he taught mantra meditation. So he would give you a mantra and you would sit with the mantra. He wouldn't really tell you how to do it. He wouldn't, suggest that you focus on a different inner body part. He would just say, repeat the mantra and you'll go into meditation. And of course, in his tradition, the driver of meditation was grace, was Shakti. And the Shakti was in the mantra. So what we were trained in was just saying the mantra and, finding a way to identify with it and allowing the process of meditation to unfold on its own, which in the early days that I was meditating in his company actually unfolded quite dramatically. But at a certain point, it just stopped going anyplace. And I went through a few years, and I recently read a text in the Sankhya tradition, which talks about this particular way that a human being can get stuck, that a meditator can get stuck, because you kind of believe that the spiritual growth process is like physical growth. You don't have to struggle. Uh, you know, as a 5-year-old, you don't have to struggle to grow into being a 10-year-old. And one of the understandings we tend to have about spiritual growth is that if you just keep saying your mantra, or you just keep following the breath, you just keep doing your mindfulness practice, that you're going to naturally grow into the next stage. So, and this is to a certain extent true, but my experience was that there just comes a point where it stops. You're at a plateau, you can't really go further. And then the question is, am I going to go on like this? Am I just going to have this basically routine meditation practice that's, a lovely part of my life, but kind of so what? Or am I going to take agency and play and experiment and be creative and see if I can jumpstart the process, deepen the process? So that was just something I came to once I decided to empower myself, to say, well, okay, my guru didn't teach me about this. So how am I going to learn it? And I did it by questioning, by asking, by trying things out, because of course there are a wealth of meditation techniques that we have available to us, especially these days. Trying this out, doing it for a little while, and then asking myself, because what really empowers you in meditation is when you begin to meditate for long enough in a single sitting, so that stuff starts to happen in your inner body, in your heart, in your central channel, that you're being given directions from inside. There's a kind of like a mantra will come up that you're not used to practicing, or that something will say to you, okay, why don't I try breathing into my belly, or why don't I try extending my heart, or what would it feel like to bring my attention to the Dwadashanta, the Sahasrara? So you begin to get these instructions from inside, and you begin to follow them. And at that point, your meditation begins to be self-guided, or what I would call Shakti guided, because your own meditation is teaching you meditation. And this, by the way, is something I heard from my guru very, very early in my relationship with him. People would ask him, so what should I do to increase my meditative experience? He would say, meditation will teach you meditation. He never explained what that meant, but this is what it means. It means you're going to start getting directions that nobody taught you. And they're like intuitive instructions that are about how you as an organism can move forward, or move inward, or move deeper, or move higher. And then your job is to follow those instructions. So that's what it is to take agency in meditation. And that's what I try to encourage people to do. I think partly because most of us have so much self-doubt that we worry about the messages we're getting from inside. Are they real messages, or is this just some stuff my mind is coming up with? The only way you find out is to follow them. And meditation is a very safe place to follow inner guidance. You're not going to fall off a bridge, or get involved with somebody who'll hurt your feelings, or get pregnant, or any of the other things that can happen when you follow so-called inner guidance. And one of the advantages, one of the gifts that you get from following guidance in meditation, is that you learn which guidance is reliable and which isn't. So being creative with your practice is incredibly empowering in every area of your life.
That gives me chills when you talk about that, Sally, of just like the way that you really frame following the Shakti guidance, that inner wisdom as that is the meditation guiding the meditation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard someone articulate it so well. And it gives me shivers just to hear you to name it, because it's, in so many, I just want to, there's so many practices. It feels like it robs us. There's the guidance in the beginning of,
Yeah.
in asana or meditation or pranayama, or any of the technology towards these states. But I think what often feels like it gets lost is how to return someone back into their own agency, so that this Shakti guidance, this inner wisdom is they themselves are their own best teacher.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, let me just say a caveat here. When I teach meditation, and what I recommend is that you actually create for yourself a core practice, which can often be very structured. So, you might start with a rigorous seat, do a little bit of pranayama or deep breathing, or just attention to the breath, and then find a practice that either you've been taught or that you particularly love, which might simply be following the breath, bringing a mantra into the heart. That practice, after a while, will start to actually jumpstart the inner calling. That there is a certain point in meditation where, in the Yoga Sutras, they talk about how you begin with dharana, with concentration, and then at a certain point you fall into dhyana, which the Yoga Sutras generally defines as becoming one-pointed on the object of your concentration. But in Shakti meditation, dhyana is actually a spontaneous state that arises. So the core practice that you're doing is training it, starting by training the mind, but at a certain point, it's like you've created a pathway through your core practice, which is calling to the inner meditative state. And the meditative state will start to emerge. And that's the point at which you can just sort of throw the whole thing open, let go of the core practice, and see what wants to happen. The core practice is important, and especially when you're beginning. Adyashanti tells a story that he was a Zen student, and his teacher sent him to a famous Zen master to do a retreat at one point. And he was sitting in meditation in the retreat, and he started to get guidance. And he went to, in Zen retreats, you have a dokusana conversation with the teacher. So in his first dokusana, he said to the teacher, so I'm getting these instructions from inside, and is it okay if I follow them? His teacher said, no, you should do the practice I'm giving you. And it was very strong about it, very strict about it. So I just said he went back and started to do the practice that the teacher had insisted that he do. And the next day he went back to Dokusan. The teacher said, okay, it's okay if you follow the instructions that are coming from inside. And I thought, as I thought about that story, which I think if I had been his teacher, I would have done exactly the same thing. I would have said, before you start making things up, just make sure that you know how to follow the instructions. So it's very important, to create a certain rigor in your practice before you start to experiment. Because the rigorous instructions, the follow the breath, repeat the mantra, they're ways of training the mind to focus. They develop your focus muscles. And if you don't have focus muscles, your meditation is going to be all over the place. And, you're never going to develop one of the main powers that meditation can give us, which is the power to be one-pointed and truly indrawn. So that's the caveat. And so I would say, if you want to do serious experimentation and meditation, and you're just starting, give yourself 3 to 6 months where you're actually doing a rigorous version of a core practice. And when you start feeling the meditative state as something that you can access, that's when it becomes skillful to begin to be creative with the practice. And one more thing, not everybody does well with breath practice. Not everybody does well with mantra practice. Some people, are better off with a visual practice. Some people really are direct path practitioners where being aware of awareness is the most skillful way to meditate. You need to find out what works best for you overall. And that's one of the things that I think a good teacher of meditation will do is give people choices, give people experience in different, 4 or 5 of the main types of meditation, and give people the opportunity to see, okay, where does my heart call me? What's the easiest practice for me to get into meditation with, so that you're choosing your core practice in, kind of in consultation with the teacher. If you don't have a physical teacher, you can practice with an online course or even a book. And meditation, for the love of it, just does give you a number of practices that you can play with, that you can try.
Thank you. Is that also what you mean by going into finding what your particular doorway is?
Yeah. So, for instance, in the tradition that I was trained in, though other practices were introduced, essentially everyone was given a mantra, and that was the practice. So for people who didn't enjoy mantra practice, it was difficult. That it felt like just routinely repeating a Sanskrit word. And so a lot of people who are, it's very, very true in mindfulness practice, because, in traditional mindfulness practice, which is the way most of us are introduced to meditation in modern times, you're following the breath, you're counting breaths. And if you need more juice, if you need more bhakti, if you need more imagination in your practice, that mindfulness practice is going to be very boring. And, I have to say, I love that simple breath practice. I do it a lot. But it was probably 10 or 15 years before I began to experience the ecstasy, and it is really ecstasy, of the breath coming into the nostrils and flowing through the body. You have to be able to get very granular with the felt sense of the breath in order to experience the joy and the juice of that practice. And, so I feel that it's best to start with a practice that really feels good to you right off the bat. Whether it's mantra, whether it's meditation, whether it's meditating on one of the inner centers, often with the visualization. One of the practices that a lot of people that I work with find very delightful is the practice of, bringing a flame into the heart, or imagining the breath rising with a sense of light or fire from the heart to the Ajna chakra. The visual is important to visually oriented people. So that's part of the experimentation that it's helpful to do. And if you have a teacher who's willing to go with you, who's willing to interface with you and help you find the practice that floats your boat, that's really helpful. That said, if you're simply doing the practice that your teacher wants you to do, even if you don't love it, it's going to jumpstart your concentration muscles. It's going to help you become one-pointed. So there's, of course, enormous value in doing any form of concentrative meditation practice.
Sounds like what I hear you articulating is the formal practices give a container and help refine our attentional skills so that we can then have both containment and attention to follow the sort of Shakti guidance in that way.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. You know, one of the I think it's Alan Wallace who wrote a book on attention. He's a Tibetan teacher who this particular book is on mindfulness, and he points out that mindfulness practice is a direct antidote to ADD, to attention deficit disorder, which is a society-wide disease. I think we all have it one way or another. So just returning your attention to the breath, letting go of the thoughts, returning to the breath, is going to train you in attention, as you say. Same with Mincha. So it's the intention to keep one thought or one focal point in your mind that begins to train these faculties. And one of the things I would suggest if you're a fairly new meditator and you want to combine a kind of rigorous attentional practice with something more creative, is to spend 15 minutes in the beginning of your meditation practice really, really focusing on whatever the concentrative practice is that you've been given. And then in the last 5 minutes, do something else, perhaps become aware of awareness, if that's your bent, or imagine a flower in the heart, or imagine the breath opening up the space in the center of the forehead and, reaching out. In other words, do something creative, visual, an awareness practice, or take a word or an idea that you'd like to explore, such as I am love, and just bring it into your meditation. And so use 5 minutes at the end of your practice, once you've brought yourself inside, to play in your meditation.
One of the questions that came up, Sally, and because as I mentioned earlier, that in this very tantric perspective or way, that any moment or any particular feeling or thing is a doorway into the divine.
Yeah.
And one of the examples might be something like anger, or the challenges we're interfacing right now of how we. So I'm hoping you could speak to a little bit more how we might really expand our palette as to how anything can actually bring us into the divine experience.
Yeah. The anger practice, the kind of classical tantric anger practice, is to, when anger comes up, first you have to sort of say stop. In other words, you have to stop yourself from acting on it. When anger comes up, you go right into the feeling state of anger. In other words, you turn normally anger is outer directed. Even when it's directed at ourselves, there's a whole complex, a web of thoughts around it. So you have to sort of move your attention through the thoughts, move your attention through the story, let go of the story, as the Buddhists say, and really focus directly on on what the feeling state of anger is. And if you can stay focused on the anger itself and resist the temptation to go back into your story and go back into the reasons why you're angry, what you start to notice is that anger is energy. There's a particular quality of energy that goes with anger, just as there's a particular quality of energy that goes with fear. So directly meditating on the energy inside it is going to change it and is going to actually allow the energy to move. It will allow the anger to kind of open up and dissipate. And it makes it available to be used in some other way. And I have to say, from my own experience, this is a hard meditation. It's not a beginner's meditation. It's an advanced tantric practice, as I've discovered whenever I've tried to give it to somebody who who hasn't done some work with anger management, for example. So if you're going to do emotionally based meditation, it's really helpful if you've done a little bit of your psychological inner work first, so that you're not so much the victim of the backpack of old anger and all the stories that you've been carrying since early childhood. Because otherwise, when an anger comes up, you're going to it's as most of you know, it's going to join to the karmic backpack of all the horrible things that have been done to you in the past, and you won't be able to work directly with the anger. So another way of working with intense emotions that is kind of more accessible is to imagine space around it. And this is another tantric practice. I teach a lot of deity practices, and one of the deities that I often work with is a tantric goddess called Bhuvaneshwari, whose nature is embracing creative space. She's really she represents the embrace of Shakti, which or in classical yogic terms, the embrace of Prakriti, the creative power within nature. And if you could imagine a spaciousness around your body and allow that spaciousness to surround your anger or your fear, and feel that to do this, you actually have to be in the felt sense of the emotion. In other words, to do these practices, you do have to let go of the story. So if you can find the felt sense of anger or the felt sense of fear, find where it is in your body, and then surround it with space and just hold the feeling in space, whatever it is, whether it's depression, whether it's fear, whether it's worry, whether it's anxiety, then there will be the energy will morph, the space will enter the energy, there'll be a release, there'll be a relaxation. This is really a very effective practice. And I have a feeling that, that a certain amount of this kind of practice is done in somatically based trauma work, as I recall, that finding the feeling state of the energy in your body and then holding it will help release it. And this is originally a tantric practice.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I was just going to comment on that. And so one thing before I comment on that is what I really hear being articulated is in every sort of flavor, anger, sadness, any flavor of consciousness can bring us back to, if we ride that energy, it just brings us back to the divine or back to Shakti or however it was.
Yeah. I want to say too that, however, that to do this kind of hardcore tantric work with intense emotions, it actually makes a big difference if you've done some psychological work. In other words, if you have actually looked into some of the underlying reasons, some of the core issues that you're carrying in your life, and just understood them, and understood something about the phenomenon of projection, for example. So, there's enormous benefit in combining Western psychological practices with these deep tantric understandings. They work with the same issues, but from slightly different points of view. They are very, very congruent with each other.
Yeah. I've made there's some great scholarly articles about how actually somatic psychology, if we really trace back the origin, we find its origination in tantric practices.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'll send you some of those articles.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, my recognition is like, even when I've studied any of these, as a somatic psychologist, as I've studied all of these things, I was, I was like, why does all this sound so familiar? it's just a different language base and different type of containment. But essentially the containment practices are still about getting people secure enough to go in and essentially be with these vibrational essences to allow them to ride through back. They don't call it back to the divine by any means. In somatic psychology, it often is devoid of that spiritual interconnectedness, but it would talk more about it more as a neutral state.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And from another point of view, the objective witness that people access in certain forms of psychotherapy is, of course, a version of, the ultimate witness, the witness who's eventually turns out to be God.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's an enormous congruity. And I do believe that a lot of profound insight arose in the 19th century in some of the experimental clinical thinkers in psychotherapy and psychology, Freud and Jung and many others. But also since Westerners have been doing Eastern practices, I would say that it's given rise to an enormous amount of creativity in therapeutics as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing you were naming before as well is what could be identified in one tradition as knowing and loving, or as sort of the ability to witness and experience. That we talk a lot about that in somatic trauma therapy is the in dissociative experiences, there's a break between sort of knowing and loving or witnessing and experiencing. And the
Right.
intentionality is to remarry what was never really divorced.
Yeah, great. That's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful.
So I really appreciate that. Maybe one more question, if that's
Sure.
okay. This was an interesting one that I thought, out of most of my teachers who teach of this in this practice, I felt like most comfortable asking you this particular question that actually came up from a student and I had, which was this concept of how do we navigate moving towards oneness, and especially in common times, not letting that be a bypass so that we recognize difference.
Yeah. Yes. Especially in the current, well, certainly in the United States,
Yeah,
there's so much emphasis on understanding difference.
yeah,
Uh, it's a really good question, and it's one I think about a lot. So let me just say the way I've resolved it, or the way I work with it, is that, and I have to say I'm a universalist. I mean, I came into this world believing that everyone was basically alike, which I subsequently learned is not the case at all. But I mean, I actually had to learn this the hard way. But I do believe that if you have a fundamental uh, intention to recognize common humanity on the deepest level, the fact that everybody wants to be happy and is going about it the best way they know how, sometimes in a pretty fucked up way, but essentially with that intention, and that, and then start to be willing to recognize differences, cultural differences, experiential differences, uh, differences in interest, but always with a recognition that behind all the differences, there is humanity, or uh, consciousness, awareness, the desire to thrive, to live, because obviously we have to include animals and plants in our understanding of the different levels of experience. So they're two, it's part of the paradox of life. We are unique. Each one of us is unique. Each one of us has unique experiences. And all of us share an enormous amount of our normal experience, especially human beings. And all of us are arising and subsiding, our personal experiences arising and subsiding inside consciousness. And at the core, it's made of love. So if your call is to come back to love, to get to love, which doesn't necessarily have to mean agreement, doesn't necessarily have to mean, obvious sweetness and harmony, but what we mean by love is the recognition of the same consciousness as in you, as in others. If you have that intention, I think it makes it much easier to not only deal with differences, not only to recognize your own mistakes, but also to be interested in all the ways that we're different. It's so interesting that this world is so incredibly diverse. Why would we want it to be otherwise?
Beautifully said. And I really appreciate your perspective on that, because it's not an easy question, or not not an easy question. And I think one that many of us, perhaps in this journey, this yogic journey, especially right now, are interfacing with.
Yeah. And where is the bypassing? And, there's always this question of, am I bypassing difficulties that need to be addressed? The other one is, am I getting lost in the difficulties and forgetting the underlying commonality? Because we do have to balance those.
How do we do that? I'll just keep calling and asking if that's okay.
I'm on that journey too.
Well, thank you for that humanistic response. And thank you so much, Sally. I just want to thank you so much for connecting with everyone around and writing this book, because I think it stands as a testament that our practice can be our own, that we're entitled, or it is a birthright for our own unique divine consciousness to guide our process.
Yes, and so it is, and may we all know that.
Yeah.
And may we all go to the depths of ourselves in this journey through whatever modalities are ours. So thank you, and thank you all for being here, and force be with us.
Yeah, thank you, Sally, and thank you everyone for joining us, and those who will be watching later. You can always keep writing into the Facebook group, and we'll keep talking about this stunning book. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Sally. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.